Board games are a surprisingly ancient pastime. Some will stand up to scrutiny for centuries, like chess, Go, and Mahjong. Some inspire adaptations like how Candyland wouldn't exist without the game of Goose. While others, like the ancient Egyptian board game Senet, would fade into obscurity. The oldest examples of these date back to 5,000 years ago. All that to say is that over centuries, humans have honed their ability to make board games, but so what? In the same span of time, we've also figured out how to make fire, yet we still have the yearly need for an anthropomorphic bear to tell us not to do forest fires. So before we ruin board games in much the same way, let's ditch these physical pieces for some digital ones. Obviously, reconstructing board games for a digital format was a massive asset to early game designers, as all they had to do was make the art assets and program the rules of the game into the cartridge, which still isn't an easy task, but having 1/3 of the work done for you is still a massive leg up. Tic-tac-toe, backgammon, Othello, chess, checkers, simple games that had existed for years were smash hits with the new video game audience. The one thing that these digital representations introduced that set themselves apart from their board-based counterparts was the introduction of the computer player. Gone are the days of going over to your neighbor's house asking Joey Desinfants to come over for a rousing game of pinochle. Now you can avoid all contact with that crook thanks to the built-in opponent. While these games may seem rudimentary by today's standards, this serves as a sturdy groundwork for the future of board games in the medium. The better the hardware gets, the more advanced they feel. Now look at what we have today, beautifully animated titles that allow us to host family game nights from 2,000 miles away. Currently, we are in an era of board games like never before. Does Settlers of Catan feel a little too intimidating to learn, and you don't have friends who will simultaneously teach and play with you? Now just get it on the Switch. Let it teach you while also giving you opponents who match your skill level. Titles that have mass appeal now have an added layer of accessibility. Like for a second, let's just be real with ourselves. Monopoly is neither an easy game nor a short one. There's a lot of math, conflicting rules a la how you use free parking, consistent stalemates, and if you're a special type of dirtbag, literal embezzlement. Hasbro and Parker Brothers have tried to get around this with different iterations of the base board game. Things like implementing a credit card system or making a more kid-friendly version is all well and good, but turning this into a video game is by far the easiest way to add accessibility for everyone. This greatly reduces playtime while also increasing the amount of games finished. It's kind of funny to me that I've always wanted more freedom in video games, but in reality, I crave this rigid enforcement of the rules. Because in this instance, having those guides set up allows me to pay more attention to the fun and social parts of Monopoly, rather than memorizing the rulebook. So it would appear that we've sort of entered a golden age of board games, but I think it's first important to address the dark ages that we just came out of. Game companies from the late 2000s to the mid-2010s really loved to unnecessarily push the envelope. Sometimes this leads to amazing innovations, and other times it leads to Bomberman Act Zero. When you have a near-perfect formula, fans tend not to want you to shake it up too much. There is a time and place for resting on your laurels. That being considered, Milton Bradley said, "To hell with this leaf crown," and proceeded to make Twister for Kinect. These two things, much like milk and Red Bull, should have never been mixed. While yes, the Kinect was known for its revolutionary new leg tracking technology, it wasn't all that great at doing it. The amount of space required for a game that focuses on legs is staggering. Just to play Kinect Sports, I have to rearrange my entire living room. Add on top of that the difficulty in tracking limbs when you get all twisted up on the ground. That doesn't even sound like a practical game for the Kinect. So they didn't make it. Instead, they gave us this. Could I have looked up a walkthrough? Yes. Did I? No. And now here I am, looking like a damned fool, trying to fit myself into digital shapes with my ass out to the world. It's I don't even know how to describe this.
This is the most degrading thing I think I've ever done.
Yes, this is Twister for the Kinect. The same 4 mini-games ad nauseum. To complete one of the 3 campaigns, you have to play some slight variation on one of these 4 games. Ooh. 30 times. And that's it. There are co-op and party modes, but it's still the same 4 mini-games just with another person next to you. And that's it. $50 for a game that your grandma assumed was the board version, and what you get is hole in the wall. There's already a hole in the wall for Kinect, never mind. There really wasn't much hope for Kinect Twister. Disregarding the strange interpretation, the original Twister is just an excuse to get handsy with people you shouldn't be getting handsy with in the first place. Now, if you thought Kinect Twister was off the mark, just wait until you get a hold of what Family Game Night 3 has in store for you. You have your classics like Life, Mousetrap, Clue, a remix of Yahtzee in the form of a card game, and then you have Twister. Any guesses to how they adapted this motion-based board game into a controller-friendly experience? Is it a collection of mini-games? A puzzle game similar to Tetris? A Simon Says clone? Or a card game? It's a memory game. Simon Says with a facade of DDR. These people are using the Twister license for everything under the sun.
Twister.
The t-shirt.
Twister.
The coloring book.
Twister.
The lunchbox.
Twister.
The breakfast cereal.
Twister.
The flamethrower. That kids love this one.
This version gets a bit of a pass because the theme of this entry into the Family Game Night franchise was remix. Play all the games listed above in full, abbreviated formats, or even remixed situations. But they could have pulled from any number of their famous games. Guess Who, Candyland, Chutes and Ladders, these could have used a fresh coat of paint, and none of them were chosen in previous iterations into the franchise. Every title into the Hasbro Family Game Night has some different take on Yahtzee. You've got standard Yahtzee 2 times in a row, Yahtzee with cards, and whatever Yahtzee bowling is. You're telling me that they can consistently remake a dice rolling game, but they can't find a feasible solution for not using Twister? All I've learned from this rabbit hole is that Twister has some really strong brand power and loyal fans, because the insistence on bringing Twister into the video game space baffles me on not only a technological level, but a financial one too. Oh, but wait. Hasbro isn't quite done sinking into the realm of gratuitous video games just yet. Battleship. The game of guess and check, with all the same tension as filling out standardized test bubbles at random with none of the life-altering stakes. There once was a peaceful time in Battleship's history, where the most deviation we saw were digital versions that added a few different board types and people playing by the salvo rule set, an alternate method of playing found in the original rulebook that saw players using barrage fire equal to the amount of ships unsunk. But then in 2000, Hasbro Interactive decided to play with the formula a little bit. In Battleship Surface Thunder, we see digital versions of the plastic pieces acting like their real-world counterparts. It's a very simple game stripped of all the strategy that the series is known for. Not good, not bad, weird, but reasonable. And for 12 years, Battleships wouldn't be hassled, allowing it to live in peace. That is, until Optimus Prime decided to turn into a money printer instead of a semi-truck. This era of revitalization from Michael Bay's box office style saw him and folks like him take on the monolithic task of making children's toys into summer blockbusters. Transformers, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and G.I. Joes are all understandable picks to receive this IRL treatment. But then someone had to go and suggest that Hasbro throw in a second IP into the mix. And seeing the success of Transformers, they did not hesitate. Battleship was not a great pick, however. It has plenty of open space to imagine a narrative, but lacks all foundation, which ends up posing a very big challenge.
In order to properly analyze the PS2, Xbox 360, 2012 classic hit Battleship the Movie the Game, we must first analyze the film that spawned it.
This is really a paint-by-numbers sort of film involving military bros, aliens with unstoppable technology, and big-budget VFX that get so overused that it becomes boring. I did have high hopes that this film would either be a niche cult classic or at the very least, something so bad it was good. I found it to fall into neither category, unfortunately, which is a real shame because this could have easily been a killer parody movie. The scene is set just right. Stiffen up a few characters, throw in a few meta jokes, add a few more scenes like this.
It's not today. Let's drop some lead on those motherfuckers.
They Tokyo drifted a 70-year-old warship with the assistance of old veterans who originally helmed the thing. If there were limits to how over the top a movie could get, then this scene is definitely the ceiling. The shift from hyper machismo action film to action comedy is honestly not that hard of a transition and could have easily been pulled off here. Battleship even opens with a shift in audience expectation. We have a classic bar scene that begins with the protagonist getting drunk as the film's love interest walks in. Most other blockbusters would have the lead do something macho to prove himself to the woman, but instead, Battleship decides on having him break into a nearby convenience store, Mission Impossible style, to steal a chicken burrito for her.
Please.
It's too late to eat a burrito. Too many complex carbs.
$3.99.
This movie was absolutely set up for parody greatness. However, since it's a film made by committee that focuses on showing the US military might, it was never meant to be. While most folks will only remember the ludicrous premise of the film and the fact that it was a box office failure in the US, it's important to say that the film did end up making a profit once it was shipped overseas. Now, on to how the film incorporates pieces of the board game. Did you miss it? Let me show you a few more examples. Fooled ya! Those were the only two ties to the source material, the grid and the alien bullets being called pegs. Take those two things out, and this could have been any early 2010 era sci-fi blockbuster. Was I hoping for more? Maybe. But I don't think shoehorning in other aspects of this very simple children's game would have been a good addition.
With the film out of the way, now we can better assess the video game.
We kick off by not following any of the characters from the film. Instead, you're a random soldier who ends up doing more to fend off this arm of H.R. Geiger rejects than the entire cast of the movie. Seriously, you mow down aliens as if they're foam board in front of a 6-year-old after karate practice. In the film, it took like 5 folks and a handful of machine guns just to dent one of these dudes. Not to mention, the ships in the fleet handled the extraterrestrial armada with no issue. Looking back at the film, they couldn't even get a single hit unless they sacrificed the whole kit and caboodle along with the crew members. The rules set up in Battleship the movie are not even remotely followed in Battleship the movie the game, which is a real shame because much like the film, the video game had a lot of promise. It's an FPS where there's a simultaneous real-time ship battle that you have to command. Aspects in the FPS side affect the ship battles with things like collectible upgrades and extra powers, while things in the naval side allow you to call in airstrikes and help on the ground. This new angle to the genre adds a unique feel to this experience, making your tactical advantages dependent on ship placement while your naval power levels up as more enemies are vanquished. This means that every encounter has 2 sides, which would be great if the same 3 boring levels weren't recycled, the weaponry was at all fun to use, the story was interesting, and the enemy AI lived up to the I in its name. Even on the game's hardest difficulty, your tactical advantages don't contribute in a meaningful way, as normal guns will do the job just fine. These secondary systems are more of an afterthought than a foundation, which is a real shame because these interlocking systems are so clever. Unfortunately, they're wasted on a game doomed to be forgotten.
Now on to the most convoluted example that will take us from children's book to movie to board game to children's TV show, then to an MS-DOS game. After which is another film, followed up by an iOS game, another board game, then a third film, finally culminating into a full-release video game. So strap in as we descend into my findings from a multi-month expedition into Jumanji.
Chris Van Allsburg is an author of many beloved children's books. His notable works include The Polar Express, The Garden of Abdul Ghazazi, and Zathura. But we're gonna look at his first award-winning book, Jumanji. Released in 1981, this book tells the story of two bored kids who go on fantastical adventures through the jungle while awaiting their parents to come home. It's a tale of using one's imagination to fill in the gaps of a story and occupy your time creatively. The book leaves a lot of room for interpretation. How is this game made? How does the magic work? Was the journey even real? None of these questions are answered, instead letting you connect the dots how you see fit. Accompanied by Allsburg's signature Diet MC Escher-esque illustrations, this book exemplifies what makes his writing so special. It's the kind of book that turns any old library into a magical wonderland. That same magical feeling would be what attracted director Joe Johnston to attempt a film adaptation 14 years later. While turning a children's picture book into a film on the surface may seem like a silly concept, what the cast and crew were able to do with this film was nothing short of lovingly crafted. It captures that same feeling of space between the lines that the source material had, which is especially impressive as that's an intangible feeling that you have to set out to achieve from day one. While the film's use of CG clearly looks dated and the cinematography attempts a more Spielbergian style rather than trying to imitate the Allsburg illustrations, the heart of the film stands firmly with the book. I know that they follow the same format for Allsburg's other books, Zathura, but the two share a lot of similar themes and plot lines, with the only thing separating the two being time, film tech getting better, and a sci-fi aesthetic. So for sake of time, I'm just gonna focus on Jumanji as it was the first and it got the bigger franchise. This game was dead on arrival. There was no way it could live up to the film. This prop is gorgeously made. The gritty wood finish, stone pieces, and the center gem made for something immediately enticing to children who saw the film. What we got, however, was fake wood pieces, a plastic rhino, and a center decoder made out of flimsy plastic. This is one of the lowest quality board games I've seen in recent memory. Come on, ancient Egyptians made higher quality parts than this. Jokes aside, the designers really tried their best when setting up the rules, as the fail state could never really be as dire as the version seen in the film. For those of you who haven't experienced it, Jumanji the board game is a fast-paced dice-rolling experience where you have scenario cards akin to the situation seen in the film. You have to roll the dice to get an object that saves you from whatever predicament is on the card. If the timer runs out before the correct item is rolled, you get to add it to the doomsday pile. Fill up this side of the board and it's game over for all players. Adding a total fail state does a decent job at trying to facilitate the same amount of tension as in the film, but this tension is reliant on the number of players. If you go with a minimum 2 people, then the doomsday pile is almost a non-issue as there's a very low chance of failing a dice roll. The more players you add, the higher chance of a failed dice roll, thus more excitement. So when it was just me and my fiance playing for this episode, we beat the game in 15 minutes, had 1 card on the doomsday board, and just didn't have all that much fun. I will say though, that while Jumanji isn't the world's best board game, it does do a considerably good job when you look at the monolithic task of recreating the experience seen from the movie.
After this, there was a Windows DOS game released, as well as a children's TV show that ran from 96 to 99, having 40 episodes.
The American exclusive DOS game titled Jumanji, a Jungle Adventure Game Pack, is a collection of mini-games based on scenes from the film. A short and simple title that can be finished in under 30 minutes. Only hosting 5 different arcadey mini-games with a high scoreboard, this is the closest we got to having a game that does the original film justice. Now, if they would have allowed you to play the actual board game and substituted the dice rolls for these mini-games, we could have gotten a real Jumanji experience. That would have required a lot more time and effort, something I don't think the developers had. The cartoon doesn't fare much better. Ugly animation styles, bad writing, and breaking the rules that the film set up, as well as the board game, makes this a downright annoying viewing experience. Every episode sees the kids from the movie getting sucked into the board game, but for that to happen, they would both need to simultaneously land on the proper space. The likelihood of this happening is very slim, so the writers just said, to hell with the rules, and sent them both in at the same time. Not to be a narc, but there are a lot more rule-breaking incidents through these episodes. Jumanji up until this point has been a string of lovingly crafted adaptations and interpretations, but this just doesn't cut it. Unfortunately, this is the last thing we would see from Jumanji for almost 2 decades. There was a planned sequel being worked on around the end of the television show, which would have existed in the same world, but wouldn't follow the same characters. instead strangely opting to have the President of the United States buy the board game at an antiques auction. Steve Buscemi was cast to play the antagonistic VP, and the film would have centered around the president's struggle of work-life balance and being a good father. This was slated to come out December of 2000, but due to director Kent Ralston stepping down, the film got shelved.
You know what? I'm glad this film didn't come out, because outside of seeing Steve Buscemi in another film, that plot sounds genuinely horrible. And what we got instead was a far superior adaptation.
The reboot of Jumanji had been in talks since 2012, with more definitive insider information coming out around 2015. This was met with internet disdain, as we had just lost Robin Williams a year prior, and up until this point, he had remained the face of the franchise. This film got delayed for 2 more years to let that heat die down. I think that this was a stellar idea, because negative press could have killed what ultimately became a solid restructuring of the universe's rules and aesthetic choices. I'll admit that I didn't come into this movie with a very open mind. I too assumed that this would ruin the franchise. The opening act was not strong enough to win me over. I'll admit that switching mediums from board game to video game was a hard concept to visualize, but you quickly forget about that once you meet the characters. The best distraction for a mistake is always someone failing worse than you. These characters are written worse than Oblivion NPCs. They have 2 traits and static dialogue. Your initial meeting with them is so unsavory and unbearable that I almost turned it off. Thankfully, I pushed forward, because as soon as the main 4 take the stage, it's all uphill. Jack, Kevin, Karen, and Dwayne blend together for a smooth comedy quartet. While the film chooses to focus on the genius duo of Kevin Hart and Dwayne the actor Johnson, Jack Black steals the show later on. Further on into the film, Nick Jonas makes an appearance, giving off an absolutely perfect Nathan Drake performance. Unfortunately, it's in the wrong movie, and they made some really bad casting decisions for this Uncharted movie. Anyway, this portion of the cast is flawless, and they make it count. I laughed out loud multiple times, to the point where I had to pause because I couldn't breathe, making this 2-hour film reach into the 150-minute territory.
So what? The movie's good. But does it follow the rules and ratios set up by the source material? Actually, yes. And it does a good job given the circumstances.
As mentioned before, the studio wanted to attract a new demographic of youth, as board games were becoming more of a niche than they were in the 90s, a challenge that would seem to change the very fabric of the franchise. But like a broken record, I'll state it again, the foundation of the Jumanji franchise is built on allowing viewers' interpretation of the world while also laying out the rules of the world simply and consistently. By that metric, both of the new Jumanji films pass. The dire consequences for playing the game are still the same, the only thing that's changed is location. This removes the home field advantage that the players had in the original and balances that out by giving the new players additional skills and bodies that they didn't otherwise have. Along with that location swap, we get to see what Alan Parrish experienced all these years later without the tedious need to enter and exit Jumanji like we saw in the cartoon. Going inside allows for smooth additions to backstory and the mythos of the game. The rules have changed in order to reflect the video game aesthetic, which feels a bit strange at the start, but the film really wouldn't have worked without this switch. It's clear that the folks making this cared about preserving that feeling that the source material was known for, and in return we get 2 wonderful films. There were attempts at making a video game from this reboot. First, we saw Jumanji the mobile game, a small-scale Monopoly-type situation that was a real-time PvP board game. A cool concept that had nothing really to do with the franchise outside of naming and character use. This was a strange marketing ploy that ultimately got pulled from the App Store a year later. There was also a planned VR experience. Much like the DOS game from the first film, this held a lot of potential to adapt all of it properly. Unfortunately, this was canceled before it could even get released.
Another year would go by and this franchise would work to get back up on its feet, and after it did, we got the sequel to the reboot in the form of Jumanji: The Next Level. The third film is where issues start to arise, but not because of the film itself. The primary issue at hand was in over-merchandising, as this was targeting the family audience. Now, I'd expect food, toys, clothes, and the like, but things start to break down when they introduced a full-release video game and a second board game.
Jumanji: The Next Level - Falcon Jewel Battle Game released the same year as Next Level. If you thought the original board game had some poor craftsmanship, then this new one will melt your brain in frustration. The board and the gym in the center are flimsy cardboard, and the tokens are made of printer paper. The mechanics are based off the new premise of body swapping seen in the film. Different characters have different abilities in the form of additions to dice rolls. There's no flavor text, however, to define the traits, which is odd because that could have just been copied from the previous film. You fight these monsters on the cards with dice rolls. Some cards offer extra tokens or lives. Once you have 6 tokens on your card, you win. If you lose 3 lives, then everyone changes characters and keeps going with a different person. Even with 4 players, this game doesn't last any more than 15 minutes tops. There was no reason this edition needed to be made. The aesthetic of the film is changed to fit the times, and going back to a board game goes in the face of the massive overhaul that the franchise saw. It misses the point entirely, along with being ugly and boring. The video game almost skirts by unnoticed too, thanks to 2019 being a year of gaming controversies and most major gaming outlets not reviewing it. Jumanji: The video game missed most folks' worst game of 2019 list. A third-person co-op adventure game doesn't sound like the worst way to go with this title, but on the whole, it looks and feels as if someone purchased 4 pre-made levels from the Unity asset store, set Jumanji character models in them, and called it a day. Levels are detailed and sprawling yet empty. Shooting arenas are obvious and boring, and the character voices repeat lines too often. And the impressions aren't even that good.
I think we got like sucked into the game.
Got it! 3 left!
Climbing, speed, boomerang, smoldering intensity.
Everyone on your guard! We can do this!
Can you give them to me when and if I need them?
Somebody take the jewel!
That doesn't sound right.
The co-op functionality isn't necessary at all. It hardly gets used in a meaningful way. This is an absolute mess of an adaptation. The worst part is, the movie sets up a perfect structure for the video game to follow. It's got rules, it's got a world, just use it. Say that like the main character's younger cousin went downstairs and found the game. Now you have a single player experience that has plenty of room to play around narratively. Additionally, the goal could be much the same as the first film. You have to get the gym and call out Jumanji. There's hub worlds that are strung together by platforming missions. You have to switch between characters to solve puzzles. Put that all together and you have a short and simple game that has more longevity than a co-op shooter. What we got instead was a game that functioned, but is missing all the things that make for a good addition to the Jumanji franchise. No story, no deeper lore, and no real reason to play. It's so strange to me that almost half of the Jumanji franchise has figured out the requirements for a proper adaptation of the classic children's novel.
With the 4th film on the horizon, I'm interested to see how this franchise moves forward. Will we get more ill-conceived games? Will we get any extra media at all? Or will poor audience reception and sales force them to stick to what they do best? We'll have to wait and see. Jumanji's now 40 years old and is now not just associated with the dice rolling game and Robin Williams flick.
Board games are in a weird position. You can try to innovate on a successful recipe as much as you want, but at the end of the day, most people will be willing to pay more for the original concept repackaged than to shell out for a fresh take. Sometimes there are clever reimaginings that add an extra layer to the game that you already liked, but nothing will ever top the ease of playing them digitally. I'm never one to discourage innovation, but I do hold a fair amount of cynicism towards companies shilling out their IPs and making games that don't remotely resemble what I assumed I would get. Not that like I saw Twister and actually thought I'd be doing like gymnastics in my front room with a PS3 controller in hand. The moral of the story is that if you're gonna try and change these massive IPs, you have to go all in on being bold rather than just chasing trends. These games are iconic enough that if Hasbro wanted to go full tilt on a project, people will listen and sales will come naturally. Just commit.
Thank you so much for watching, and if you like what you saw, maybe watch some more stuff, or share this with a friend, loved one, hated one, Reddit, Twitter, wherever you like to share things. If we keep growing, we'll keep posting. And that's a threat.